At my brother's funeral, my father, the police lieutenant, stood tall and praised his bravest son. And me, he glanced at me coldly and said, "At least she showed up." I stood at the very back. No one turned around. No one knew that I, the dispatcher girl they all dismissed, was the last person who knew who killed Dean. No one knew I was an undercover agent, and that my father was the one who signed off on the pursuit that got him killed. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to catch more haunting, mind-blowing episodes like this one. Under a sky thick with gray, the town stood still. The flag flew at half-mast above St. Andrew's Cathedral, rippling in the November wind like a breath half-held. Rows upon rows of uniformed officers' badges glinting under the pale sun stood shoulder to shoulder in reverent silence. The casket draped in the American flag rested at the altar, framed by white lilies and silence that dared not be broken. And at the center of it all, towering with a stoicism carved from 40 years of discipline, stood Lieutenant Ray Harper. My son Ray began, voice like steel wrapped in grief, was the kind of officer every father dreams of raising. His words echoed through the chamber, slicing the air like a formal eulogy and a personal monument. Dean wore the badge not for glory, not for praise, but for justice. He was born to serve, and he died doing what he was meant to do, protecting this community. A true Harper. A true man. A ripple of nods followed. Officers shifted weight arms crossed over medals. Some swallowed hard, others bowed heads in respect. Cameras clicked discreetly. Local news caught the rehearsed solemnity. But none of them looked behind to the last pew. Evelyn Harper stood there unmoving. Her black coat hung too loose on her narrow shoulders. No badge shone from her chest. No one reached out to include her in the honor guard. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't law enforcement as far as they knew. Just the techie daughter, the one with headphones instead of handcuffs. The other Harper. Her eyes never left her father's back, and then it came subtle venomous. "She showed up," Ray said, handing the folded flag to Dean's partner with practiced grace. "At least she came." He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The sting landed all the same. Evelyn's breath caught for half a second, just long enough for it to become a wound. No one around her flinched at the words. No one turned. That was the worst part, how easily her absence in the narrative was accepted. She sat through the remainder of the service without blinking. No tears. No motion. Just that same distant stare, like she was watching her brother die all over again, but this time from a farther seat. When the bagpipes wailed and the casket was carried out, she didn't follow the family. She slipped out the side exit unnoticed. Back at her apartment, she locked the door behind her, kicked off her heels, and dropped into the dark. The silence there wasn't reverent. It was surgical. No lights, just the hum of her laptop as it booted. The screen flickered to life. She didn't hesitate. She reached behind the desk and unplugged a portable GPS receiver camouflaged inside a car charger shell and connected it to her system. A custom interface blinked open Evelyn's own creation encrypted across 4 layers of federal-grade code. She had installed the device in Dean's SUV 6 months ago. Not because she didn't trust him, because she didn't trust the people around him. He had laughed when he found out. "I hope you're tracking my Starbucks stops," he had joked. "It's where I do all my best thinking." She had promised him it was a precaution, that it would delete itself after 60 days. It hadn't. Now the drive lit up with recent location data. Evelyn leaned in. The trail was clean until the final hour. His route through Route 40 into the West Woods had no abnormalities until 2:16 a.m., a sharp veer east, off protocol, a half-mile detour onto an unpaved access road that wasn't on any standard patrol path. There. That was the point where it stopped. Latitude 40, 1917. Longitude 82, 8:23. Time 2:17:43 a.m. The exact time the official report claimed Dean's vehicle lost control due to unknown mechanical failure. But Evelyn knew Dean's SUV. She had installed the diagnostic scrambler herself. Nothing mechanical would have failed unless someone wanted it to. She zoomed in on the satellite image. A crude path through the woods, the kind only park rangers or smugglers used. No lights, no surveillance, no record of entry. And yet his car had gone there. Why? She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. Every instinct in her body screamed that something was wrong. Not just the route, not just the sudden silence from the department. But the way Rick, their younger brother, also a cop, had looked away when she asked about the crash. The way her father had delivered Dean's eulogy with precision, but without once mentioning how Dean died. Evelyn exhaled, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She opened a new folder, labeled it Face 03 Dean. It was her code for third-level priority cases. Face stood for identity, a concept Evelyn had built her entire life around. The first face, the daughter. The second, the specialist. The third, the mask no one knew existed. She imported the GPS data. All of it. Coordinates, timestamps, road anomalies, comparative deviations from Dean's usual routes. Then she encrypted the folder with her federal login. Not her public login, the other one. The one connected to the Office of National Cybersecurity Operations. The one that identified her not as Evelyn the IT girl from Columbus, but as Agent Harper Asset Code RE0307A. The system beeped. Access granted. Her hand trembled slightly as she minimized the data window. On her desktop, a small blinking icon appeared linked to a private comms line routed through DC. She didn't click it. Not yet. Instead, she sat back and stared at the screen. Her reflection, barely visible in the glow, looked pale. Hollow-eyed, not from grief. From calculation. Dean hadn't died because of a freak accident. Not on a detour that specific. Not with the surveillance gap so perfectly timed. No, someone had led him there. Someone with knowledge of his route. And worse, someone inside. Evelyn clicked the folder again. She added one more note. Pattern deviates at 0217. Cross-reference internal dispatch logs. Possible interference unit 4R sensitive assignment protocol. Check Rick. She hit save. Then she turned off the desk lamp. Only the screen glowed now. A grave in pixels. A flag of silence. A face no one had cared to see until now. But that was about to change. Because this time Evelyn Harper wasn't going to sit at the back of the pew. She was going to pull the third mask off and let them see what they'd ignored for too long. Under the flickering light of her apartment kitchen, Evelyn Harper pressed her palms flat against the countertop, trying to breathe through the pressure blooming behind her sternum. The silence inside the room was a different kind of loud, now heavier after what she had seen. Her eyes moved toward the laptop still open in the living room, casting a cold bluish light across the carpet. The last folder she'd saved blinked like a pulse face 03 Dean. That name alone felt like a wound stitched too loosely. She walked back barefoot, careful as if the floor might shift. Sitting down, she exhaled slowly and opened a different terminal. She wasn't done, not yet. If the detour had been forced, if Dean had been pushed into that stretch of woods, then something had interfered. She needed to know what, and she needed to know who. Her fingers flew across the keys, calling up a buried partition on the GPS logger. She hadn't told Dean about this feature. It was a shadow log recording not just where the car went, but who else was around it. She had designed it after a federal surveillance vehicle in D.C. was cloned and used in a kidnapping. The device could detect nearby law enforcement signals cruisers, unmarked units, even civilian cars that had once pinged a secure radio frequency. Every police vehicle had a digital heartbeat. Evelyn knew how to hear it. A log appeared. She scrolled to the time 2:15:18 a.m., 2 minutes before Dean's SUV veered off course. And there it was. Anomaly detected encrypted ID signal. Source 4R J81A, internal use only. Strength high. Proximity 23 feet. Duration 47 seconds. Her breath stopped. The designation. That wasn't civilian. That wasn't a rogue signal or an old patrol ghost. That was internal. Not just within the department. It belonged to a specific category of vehicles. Internal affairs. Evelyn stared at the screen, jaw clenching so hard she could hear her molars grind. 4RJ81A. She repeated it out loud, almost to test if it sounded any less impossible. A car belonging to IA had followed Dean that night. Had been less than 30 feet away seconds before his car lost control and crashed. And no one said anything. No mention in the report. No notation in the accident file. No acknowledgement from anyone at the funeral. They knew. Someone knew. And they buried it. She pushed the laptop away, rising to pace. Her hands ran through her hair as if trying to keep her head from splitting open. Why the hell would internal affairs be following Dean? He wasn't dirty. He wasn't even close to bending. Dean had spent his entire career trying to clean up the department. Hell, just 2 months ago, he'd confided in her over coffee about an investigation he was starting on a string of missing evidence reports tied to narcotics busts. But he hadn't said names. He'd stopped himself, actually. Looked over his shoulder at the diner window. Said something cryptic. "The rot's not in the alley, Ev. It's in the badge closet." She hadn't pressed him. He was already on edge. Paranoid, even. She'd thought he was just exhausted. Now she knew better. She returned to the screen, opened the secondary accident report she had pulled from public records. The basics were all there. 2:17 a.m. crash along a service road off Route 40. No CCTV. Weather clear. No tire tracks indicated evasion. No mention of pursuit. No anomalies. Except for one. The camera at the intersection of Main and Hutchinson 2 blocks before Dean made the detour went offline for exactly 2 minutes and 13 seconds, from 2:13:54 a.m. to 2:16:07 a.m. It was a city-owned feed. Municipal network. She accessed it through a side channel she had installed 5 years ago during a cybersecurity overhaul she led for Columbus PD. Nobody remembered it existed. Nobody but her. She tried the backup cache. Local server, not cloud. Something might have survived. It took 48 seconds to extract. When the grainy footage appeared, Evelyn leaned in. The timestamp read 2:14:09 a.m. Dean's SUV. Driving normal speed. Brake lights flicker, then he slows. A second vehicle appears behind him. No lights, no markings, but unmistakably a cruiser frame. Unmarked, close. Dean looks in his rearview mirror. She could just barely see it from the reflection in the side window. His hand lifts. That subtle motion he waves. No signal of distress, no speed, no panic. He knew whoever was following him. And then just as the 2 vehicles disappear out of frame, the feed cuts to static. Evelyn closed her eyes. Dean didn't just know someone was behind him. He trusted them. She clicked back to the GPS signal log. The designation again, 4RJ81A. She needed to know who that car was assigned to. There was no open access to that kind of record, not even for her. But there was another way. She accessed a legacy vehicle dispatch record stored in the precinct's obsolete server backup, the kind most people forgot to delete. She tunneled through the layers, bypassed a rusted firewall, and input the vehicle ID. The name popped up. Supervisor Lieutenant Richard Harper. Her brother. Her younger brother. Rick. Her screen blurred for a second, not from software, but from the heat behind her eyes. Dean had been followed by Rick, and he never said a word. The screen blinked. Her system pinged again an automatic script she had set weeks ago. It displayed pattern match ID 4RJ81A confirmed in Dean's GPS log for 3 separate dates within 30 days of his death. He wasn't followed once. He was hunted by family. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't type, couldn't think, could only whisper. A vehicle from internal affairs, assigned to Rick. Something bigger was at play. Bigger than departmental politics. Bigger than family rivalry. Dean had found something. Something real. Something worth dying over. And Rick. God, Rick had been in the shadows of it all. Not just a brother, not just a cop. A ghost in the rearview mirror, a shadow with a badge. Evelyn backed away from the desk, breathing like a runner mid-sprint. Her heart was trying to outpace the truth, but it couldn't. Dean wasn't a casualty. He was a target. And somewhere inside the family, inside the department, someone had made sure he wouldn't talk. Not on their watch, not while Evelyn was still invisible. But that was about to change, because now she knew where the trail began, and she would follow every inch of rubber burned into asphalt until the mask came off whoever was behind the wheel. The dining room felt like a staged photograph, perfectly lit, deliberately composed, and entirely false. The table was set with military precision. Polished forks glinted beside porcelain plates. The roast sat untouched at the center, steaming beside a bowl of green beans no one would eat. Evelyn Harper sat at the far end, boxed in by a china cabinet, and her own silence while the two men at the head of the table filled the room with carefully curated grief. Ray Harper, still in partial uniform, spoke in clipped, authoritative tones. His tie had been loosened but not removed the badge from his old service days, still pinned to his left breast, a relic of a time he refused to leave behind. Dean would have handled that perimeter breach differently, he said, voice low, but certain spooning potatoes onto Rick's plate, tightened the fence, blocked those back routes. That's where they hit him through a soft entry point. Rick nodded solemnly. Yeah, I keep thinking the same thing. No one looked at Evelyn. No one asked what she thought. She speared a carrot with her fork and watched it splinter without eating it. Every word at that table orbited Dean's ghost. And Rick Golden Child in blue was the gravitational pull. Ray's focus never wavered from him. You're taking over some of his shifts, right? Ray asked. Already have Rick answered, chewing like he'd been born into command. The captain wanted someone who understood Dean's style. Said I was the logical choice. Ray grunted a sound that served as both approval and closure. Evelyn cleared her throat. It was the first sound she'd made since the meal started. Both men looked up, surprised she was still there. What about Cole? She asked. Rick blinked. Cole Jensen. He was Dean's new partner the past few months, wasn't he? Rick shifted in his seat. Just slightly. But Evelyn saw it. He was assigned, yeah, Rick said, focusing hard on his drink. Just routine pairing. Dean mentioned he didn't trust him, she added carefully. Ray made a noise like a quiet scoff. Dean didn't trust most people lately. Comes with rank. And pressure. Evelyn stared at her brother. Was Cole with him the night of the accident? Rick's eyes flickered. No idea. Probably not. Dean was on patrol solo. She leaned forward. Are you sure? I said probably not. He snapped a little too quickly. Ray narrowed his gaze. This isn't the time for suspicions, Evelyn. It's not suspicion, she said, her voice steady. It's a question. Rick stood, plate still half full. I've got a morning shift. Gonna crash. Ray nodded. Leave the dishes. I'll handle them. Rick left without saying goodnight. Evelyn stared at the empty hallway he'd disappeared into, then turned her eyes back to her father. Did Dean ever say anything to you about Cole? About something off? Ray didn't answer right away. He picked up a napkin, folded it slowly, methodically. Dean respected the badge. If he had issues with a fellow officer, he would have taken it up through official channels, unless he knew the channels were compromised. Ray looked at her sharply. That's a hell of a thing to suggest. I'm not suggesting, she said. I'm telling you what Dean told me. He didn't trust Cole. He thought someone was feeding bad intel to organized crime through the evidence room, through patrol logs. Ray's face tightened. Dean said a lot of things when he was tired. Evelyn stood. So do cowards. His eyes flashed. What did you say? But she didn't respond. She walked out, not slamming the door, just letting it close with the slow final click of a lock sliding into place. Upstairs in the bedroom that hadn't been hers for 15 years, Evelyn sat cross-legged on the carpet laptop in her lap and exhaled. She connected to a dark node of the CPD internal network, a port she'd quietly built during a federal audit 2 years earlier. A back door left open just for her. She entered Cole Jensen's name. The personnel file appeared. Standard entry. 34 years old. 3 years with Columbus PD. Previously transferred from Cincinnati after a temporary suspension. She clicked deeper. Incident report 1017 CIN loss of assigned service weapon. Disciplinary hold. She opened the report. The text was mostly redacted. But one section remained. Cole Jensen failed to secure his service firearm, which was later used in an off-duty assault outside known gang territory. Officer claimed the weapon was stolen from his car while parked in an unsecured lot. IA investigation cited negligence but no criminal liability. Suspended for 3 months. Returned to duty upon recommendation by Lieutenant R. Harper. Evelyn froze. Lieutenant R. Harper. She stared at the screen, rereading the line. It wasn't a mistake. Her father, Ray Harper, had personally signed the recommendation that brought Cole Jensen back onto the force. That placed him in Dean's cruiser. That embedded him beside her brother in the final months before his death. Her stomach twisted. She clicked on the recommendation file and read the justification. Cole Jensen is a capable officer who made an isolated error in judgment. He understands the consequences and has undergone remedial training. I believe in second chances when an officer shows growth and loyalty to the department. Lieutenant R. Harper. Loyalty. That word again. Always used as a weapon. Evelyn opened a new folder on her encrypted drive. She titled it simply, Mask Show 2. She dragged Cole's photo in a standard ID badge, shot smiling too widely for someone who had nearly armed a gang member. She added the disciplinary report, the vehicle logs, and the suspension form. She added her own summary. Dean distrusted him. Rick avoids questions. Father brought him back. 3 layers of silence. She sat back, watching the file upload into the growing archive of things no one wanted to name out loud. Dean had been right. It wasn't just one mask hiding something. It was a family of them. Ray Harper, Rick Harper, Cole Jensen, each one worn for a different audience. Each one crafted to convince someone that everything was fine, that the system worked, that the badge made them bulletproof. Evelyn didn't wear a badge, but she had something else. Eyes that never stopped watching, and a memory like code impossible to erase even by those who built the machine. The bar looked like it hadn't been cleaned since 1997. Flickering neon signs buzzed over cracked leather booths. The air was heavy with beer-burnt grease and a kind of forgotten smoke that clung to wood even decades after the last cigarette had burned out. It was a place for people who didn't want to be seen and even less to be remembered. Evelyn Harper walked in with her hood up and the kind of stride that said she didn't want company. The bartender gave her a nod without speaking, and she slid into the booth in the back corner. The one with a scratched-up table and a busted power outlet beneath it, the perfect setup for what she had in mind. Lena was already there, laptop open, half a gin and tonic on the table, and a devil-may-care smirk on her face. "You look like shit," she said without looking up. "I'm grieving," Evelyn muttered, pulling her bag into her lap. "And investigating." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Still trying to play both sides of the coin, huh?" "Not anymore," Evelyn replied. "This is personal." Lena closed her laptop. That was the signal. Business. They hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since that mess in Chicago with the telecom breach and the Homeland Security cover-up. But when Evelyn had sent the message, Lena replied in less than 10 minutes. Because when Evelyn asked for help, it wasn't casual. "All right," Lena said, pulling out a second laptop, her black rig, the one with no traceable MAC address, and a VPN that jumped countries like a pinball. "What are we digging?" Evelyn handed over a slip of paper. Written on it in clean block letters, 4RJ81A. Lena stared at it. License plate. Signal ID. From Dean's GPS log the night he died. It was trailing him 2 minutes before impact. Lena narrowed her eyes. "That's not just any ID. It's... Jesus, that's a command-level echo signature. Law enforcement. Government level. Internal affairs." Evelyn cut in. "That's the closest match I found. But it's not in the public system. I need deeper." Lena whistled low, then cracked her knuckles. All right, let's see how many digital fences I get electrocuted by. She plugged in a flash node, ran a bootloader, and the screen filled with code like rain. If this is what I think it is, it's going to take more than a few back doors. I don't care how long it takes, Evelyn said. I need to know who assigned that car, who signed it out, who ordered it on the street. And if it was your brother, Lena asked without looking. Evelyn hesitated. Then I want to know who put him there. Silence. Then the laptop pinged. Bingo, Lena murmured. Found the vehicle in the state's law enforcement ghost fleet. It's not tagged as IA. It's under something else. She paused. Evelyn leaned in. What? It's labeled as bait vehicle. Part of the Controlled Operation Lure Engagement System. Cole for short. Evelyn's blood chilled. Cole, as in the officer. Lena shrugged. Or someone using the same name. But this system, it's internal. Hidden under 3 layers of shell companies and encrypted under something I've only seen once before. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. What level? Lena glanced up, expression serious for the first time. Tier 3. Military adjacent. We're talking government-level data obfuscation. Think black sites, think off-book sting ops, think CIA on a bad day. She paused the scan, staring at Evelyn. Ev, what the hell are you digging into? I don't know yet, Evelyn whispered. But my brother died with that car behind him. And now I find out it was a bait unit. Lena resumed typing. Okay, let me cross-reference the operation logs. These things don't go out without authorization. Somewhere someone signed off. Another minute passed, then 2. Evelyn sat frozen while Lena's fingers moved like fury, chasing buried code through onion layers and dummy portals. Finally, Lena stopped. The screen froze on one document, a scanned PDF with a blurred agency seal at the top. Lena didn't say anything. She just turned the screen toward Evelyn, and there it was. Vehicle 4R J81A, authorized for Operation Duskville status. Active field bait unit. Purpose: controlled interaction with suspected corrupt officers. Authorization signature: Lieutenant Raymond Harper. Evelyn's vision tunneled. Her breath went shallow. Her ears rang with white noise. She stared at her father's name on the screen like it was a punch to the chest. Lena spoke gently. Your dad authorized the unit, 2 weeks before Dean's crash. No, Evelyn murmured, shaking her head. He wouldn't put Dean in danger. Maybe not intentionally, Lena said. But the bait unit was on Dean's route. That's a fact. Evelyn stood suddenly. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She paced the narrow space between Booth's hands in her hair. This makes no sense, she muttered. Why would my father want to test someone? Trap someone? Smoke out a mole, Lena offered. Ev, these ops are built to collapse on people. If Dean was involved, he wasn't dirty, Evelyn snapped. He was trying to clean things up. Then maybe someone turned it against him, Lena said. Maybe someone rerouted the target. Maybe the op wasn't just bait anymore. It was an execution. Evelyn's knees buckled slightly as she sat back down. She looked at the screen again. Ray Harper, her father, the man who gave speeches at funerals, who polished Dean's shoes before patrol, who wore the Harper name like it belonged in bronze. He had signed the document that put a ghost vehicle behind Dean's car. You can trace operational approvals, right? Evelyn asked, voice like ice. Lena nodded. Some of it, not all. But if there's a chain, I'll find it. Do it, Evelyn said. Lena tapped a few keys. I'll need a few hours. And a lot of caffeine. Evelyn stared at her father's name one last time. Then she leaned back, her voice barely above a whisper. We always thought the enemy was out there. On the streets, in the shadows. But it's not. The real rot, it's inside the badge. Lena looked at her. You think he knew what he was doing? I don't know, Evelyn said. But I'm going to find out. And if my father signed my brother's death warrant, I'll make sure everyone sees it. Outside, the wind had picked up. Another storm was coming. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She had seen the weather change before. This time, she was the one bringing it. The Harper house was silent, except for the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the living room, each second a nail driven deeper into the tension that had been building since Evelyn walked through the front door. Her father sat at the dining table, flipping through a leather-bound photo album pages worn from use, but kept immaculate like everything else in his life. His badge still sat on the table beside him, even in retirement. It wasn't nostalgia. It was control. Evelyn stood across from him, arms folded, laptop bag slung over her shoulder like a sidearm. "You signed off on it, didn't you?" Her voice was low but sharp like a scalpel. Ray didn't look up. "Signed what?" She stepped closer, the words slicing clean. "Vehicle 4RJ81A, the bait unit that followed Dean the night he died." His eyes froze mid-scan across the photo of Dean in his academy uniform. "I found the operation order," Evelyn continued. "Your name was on the authorization line. Operation Duskville." Ray finally looked up, and for a moment his face betrayed nothing. Then slowly he closed the album. The sound was soft, almost reverent. "You've been digging into internal files," he said. "Files you had no clearance to access." "That's your takeaway," she snapped. "Not the fact that Dean was being tailed by a ghost unit that you approved." Ray stood his chair, groaning under the motion. He moved toward the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cabinet with more force than necessary. "You don't understand how these things work, Evelyn." "I understand enough," she said, following. "Enough to know you put Dean in the crosshairs of a classified operation. And you never told him. You didn't even warn him." Ray turned. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous command. The kind that came from years of barking orders that didn't get questioned. Dean was a grown man, a decorated officer. If he felt something was wrong, he should have spoken up through the right channels. Evelyn's fists clenched. "He did speak up. To me. And you ignored him." Ray slammed the glass on the counter. "Because you're not law enforcement." She stared at him. "That's what this is about. Still after everything? You don't get how thin the line is," he said, voice rising. "You think this is a game of data and files. But out there in the real world, it's blood. It's bullets. It's people who don't flinch when someone pulls a gun in their face." "I've seen more blood on screens than you have in 30 years of patrols," she shot back. "And I've cleaned it up without a damn ceremony." Ray looked like he might say something else. Something cruel, maybe final. But the words stalled. He stared at her like he didn't recognize the woman standing in his kitchen. And maybe he didn't. Evelyn stepped back, disgusted. Her pulse was hammering, but her voice stayed level. "So tell me the truth. Did you know what they were doing to him? Did you know what that operation really was?" "I signed a field test for a controlled surveillance vehicle." "That's it," he said, jaw tight. Dean wasn't the target. Then who was? He hesitated just long enough to confirm her worst fear. She turned away, the room spinning slightly. Her hand gripped the back of the kitchen chair to steady herself. "You're hiding something," she said softly. "And it's not to protect Dean. It's to protect yourself." Ray didn't respond, but his silence said more than any answer. When Evelyn finally left the house, the air outside was cold and thick with the smell of early frost. Her boots crunched over dead leaves as she walked toward her car, the engine still warm from her earlier drive. She got in, slammed the door, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, like it could anchor her to some version of reality that wasn't collapsing around her. The phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut told her she had to. She pressed the green icon and held the phone to her ear. No voice. Just static at first. Then a deep, gravel-laced whisper. "You're getting too close." She didn't speak. The voice continued, calm, measured. "You think this is about your brother. It's not. It's about lines. Ones you weren't supposed to cross." Her mouth went dry. "Who is this? If you want to stay breathing." Harper stepped back. "Let ghosts bury ghosts." Click. The line went dead. She stared at the screen, the silence in the car pressing against her like a wall. Her reflection in the windshield looked different now. Harder. Sharper. less like the invisible daughter and more like someone you didn't want to follow you home. The threat wasn't empty, and the voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same cadence she'd heard in police debriefings, the same tone behind closed doors at precinct meetings. This wasn't just about Ray. It wasn't just about Rick. It was bigger, older. The rot went deeper than she'd imagined, and someone, maybe more than one, had just made it personal. She didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her laptop, tapped into the encrypted cache Lena had given her, and started tracing the signal of the call. Not just for the source, but for a name. Because Evelyn Harper didn't run, she uncovered. And this time she wouldn't stop until every name behind her brother's death was carved into the record, permanent, undeniable, and exposed. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat on Evelyn's screen, silent but urgent. Her living room was dark now, the only light coming from the laptop that sat like a weapon across her thighs. She'd changed networks 3 times in the past 15 minutes, each one bouncing her signal through servers in Sweden, Hong Kong, and Brazil, before finally settling on a clean VPN tunnel cloaked in a fake internal affairs login. The kind only someone like her could build, and no one inside Columbus PD would dare question. Not because they trusted it, but because they didn't know it existed. The system she was penetrating was supposed to be restricted internal case logs, forensic archives, post-action reports. But Evelyn had written part of its architecture during a federal compliance overhaul. She'd left herself a needle-threaded back door just in case the department ever tried to bury something too deep. And tonight that just in case had a name. Dean. She didn't flinch as the main interface loaded. Her fingers moved fast, surgical. She searched the report ID tied to Dean's accident number CR2217HP. It opened easily. Too easily. Most active cases with fatal outcomes had at least 3 levels of internal authentication. But this one? Just a basic lock. No file hash history, no edit log. That was the first red flag. The report read clean single vehicle accident. Sudden swerve. No surveillance available. Probable fatigue. No other vehicles listed at the scene. Case closed. But Evelyn didn't care about what the report said. She cared about what it didn't. She navigated to the attached media folder. 4 photos. 3 angles of Dean's crumpled SUV, one of the impact point on a tree, all time-stamped 2:39 a.m. 20 minutes after the crash. She zoomed in on the second image. Then she frowned. There, to the far left edge, just visible in the grain of a poorly compressed JPEG, was the shadow of a second vehicle. Not the kind of dark shape you could pass off as trees or fog. No, this was angular. Steel. Car. Evelyn's heart slammed once in her chest. She minimized the report and opened a deeper index, an unlisted photo dump from the field response server. Most officers didn't know it existed. It wasn't synced with their body cams or field notes, just a raw upload point that sometimes stored uncompressed images before they were reviewed or filtered for official records. She ran a batch scan for any image tagged to location coordinates matching Dean's crash site between 2:15 and 3:00 a.m. It returned 7 files. The official report had only listed 4. Her mouth went dry as she clicked the first. A high-resolution shot from a mobile field unit, taken wide probably by a first responder before the scene was sanitized. And there it was. Dean's SUV, the wrecked passenger side, and beside it, half off the road, lights off, but unmistakable, a second cruiser. Parked intact, facing away from the scene. The plate was partially visible. The side panel had mud streaks, but the number was clear enough to trace. She screenshot the photo, enhanced the plate, then paused. She didn't want to do it, not really, but she had to. She opened the internal vehicle registry and entered the first 5 digits. It pulled up one hit. Unit 19R, assigned officer Richard Harper, status active. Her blood iced over. Rick, her brother, had been there, at the scene, and he had never said a word. Evelyn leaned back, hands frozen on the key's stomach, twisting in slow mechanical dread. This couldn't be a coincidence. He wasn't just passing through. The cruiser wasn't in the distance. It was on-site, wheels pointed at Dean's wreck, no lights on. No call in the dispatch record. nothing logged. She compressed the unlisted images into an encrypted file, attached them to a secure message, and sent it to Lena. The subject line was simple: need confirmation. A minute passed, then 2. Her phone rang. Lena's voice came through, breathless and sharp. I ran the plate. Enhance the meta. It's Rick's unit, no doubt. Evelyn closed her eyes. Lena continued, quieter now. That image you sent, it's time-stamped 2:23 a.m. That's 6 minutes after Dean's SUV crashed, and Rick's cruiser is parked 20 feet away. No damage, no flashers, no signs of distress. Evelyn's voice barely came out. He was there. Yeah, Lena said. He was. And the fact that the photo wasn't included in the official report means someone removed it manually. Like someone with access and motivation. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water. She didn't drink it. Lena's voice turned hesitant. Ev, you don't think Rick... Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. She already knew what her silence meant. Rick hadn't just been at the scene. He had been there first. And whatever happened that night, whatever drove Dean off the road, it hadn't just been circumstance or bad luck. Rick had followed him. And now the second Harper brother was wrapped in silence like a noose. She opened her laptop again and stared at the last image. Dean's SUV collapsed into bark and steel. The cruiser behind it untouched, still as a ghost. She didn't cry. She didn't rage, but her body started to shake. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. Then she closed the file. The laptop clicked shut, and for the first time since Dean's death, Evelyn Harper began to feel afraid. Not of the system, not of the people chasing her, but of the possibility that the brother who had stood beside her in every family photo had been the one standing behind Dean when he died. The door to Rick's room creaked open like a warning. Evelyn hesitated in the threshold, her eyes scanning every detail like it was a fresh crime scene. His room was painfully neat, military neat. The kind of order that wasn't natural but imposed. Trophies from high school football sat untouched on a shelf. A framed commendation for outstanding initiative in field operations hung above the desk. Every part of the space screamed legacy. But Evelyn wasn't here for symbols. She moved toward the closet. Inside, the scent of starch and aftershave clung to a row of perfectly pressed uniforms, each one draped in plastic. She ran her fingers along the top shelf until she felt it a ridge, a foreign shape behind the lining. She pulled back the fabric. A small black USB stick sat taped beneath the shelf. Not marked, not labeled, but old. The plastic casing had a nick on one side. Whoever hid it hadn't expected anyone to come looking. Or maybe they had and figured no one would be brave enough to check. Evelyn slid it into her pocket and left the room before the walls could start whispering. Downstairs, she plugged it into her encrypted laptop and closed all background apps. The device whirred softly, and a single file appeared on the desktop. vid.rd 14 move. She clicked. The video opened with a sharp jostle. Someone had set the phone on a dashboard or a table hastily. The angle was skewed, showing more shadows than faces at first. Then Dean appeared, stepping into frame. His voice hit the room like a slap. You think I don't see what you're doing? Evelyn leaned forward, frozen. The video stabilized as Rick came into view. He looked younger, but not by much. The footage had to be recent. Maybe 2-3 months ago. Rick stood by a desk, arms folded, jaw tight. I'm doing my job, he snapped. Dean pointed at him, aggressive but not theatrical. He was scared, not just angry. No, you're not. You're running deliveries from busted stash houses without logging them into evidence. Rick's face darkened. Watch your mouth. Dean didn't back down. I tracked the GPS logs. Your unit makes stops that don't exist on the report sheets. You think nobody checks the route data? You think nobody's watching you? Rick turned away, rubbing the back of his neck like the weight was finally starting to show. It's bigger than you know, he said quietly. Dean laughed bitterly. Don't give me that. I've heard the same line from every crooked cop we've ever booked. There was a pause. A long one. Then Rick's voice, low and guttural. You don't understand. This isn't just about moving drugs. It's about who signs off on what gets moved and who makes sure the paperwork disappears. Dean stared at him, stunned. You're working with someone inside, he whispered. Higher up. Rick didn't deny it. He just said, I'm not the only one. Silence again. Dean shook his head slowly, a bitter smile forming. I'm gonna report it, he said. All of it. Cole, you, the whole damn pipeline. Rick finally looked at him. Really looked, and said, you won't get that far. Dean took a step closer to the camera, closer than Evelyn could bear, and leaned in. I swear to God, Rick, if anything happens to me, Evelyn will find you. Evelyn's breath caught. Dean's expression hardened. She's smarter than both of us combined. She knows more than she lets on. And she doesn't stop once she starts. The screen went dark. End of file. For a moment, Evelyn just stared at her reflection in the screen eyes, red shoulders hunched forward, face frozen in disbelief. Then her body folded. She dropped her forehead into her hands and let the sob come. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Dean had known. All this time he'd known who she really was. Beneath the IT job, beneath the Invisible Daughter Act, beneath the Harper name, he'd known she was still an agent, still watching, still ready to pick up the pieces the moment he couldn't hold the line anymore. You knew, she whispered, voice cracking. You knew I'd come for you. The tears hit the keyboard quiet as raindrops. Dean hadn't just left behind a mystery. He'd left behind a mission, and now the last mask had a face. Rick Harper. Her brother, her blood, the third face in the family, and maybe the most dangerous one of all. The night wrapped the world in asphalt silence as Evelyn pulled out of the driveway. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Her breath uneven, the USB still warm from the port in her laptop hidden in her shoulder bag. Her mind wasn't calm. It was calculating, sprinting faster than the wheels under her. She was done playing invisible. Then her headlights caught it. A black SUV, parked across the intersection, engine running, windows tinted. It didn't move. Neither did she. Her fingers hovered over the gear shift, heart tapping a warning in her ribs. She turned left. So did it. She slowed down. So did it. It was too clean, too smooth, too late at night for coincidence. Her voice, calm but clipped, slipped into the Bluetooth receiver. EagleNet, this is Agent Harper, active pursuit in progress. Possible tail make and model Chevy Suburban, unmarked plates obscured. No response. She checked her signal. No service. No bars, no data. She swore under her breath. Rural dead zones weren't uncommon, but this one right outside her father's neighborhood reeked of orchestration. The SUV surged forward, closing the distance. She gritted her teeth, floored the accelerator. Her car, an old silver hatchback, jumped forward, tires squealing. The SUV followed faster, heavier, matching every swerve. It moved like a predator, not trying to crash her, just guide her, corner her. Evelyn made a hard right into a strip mall parking lot. A 24-hour supermarket flickered in neon blues. Fluorescent lights washed the glass doors like a beacon. The SUV shot past the entrance, then braked hard, cutting across to block her exit. She didn't think. She reacted. She grabbed her shoulder bag, yanked out the hard drive from her laptop mid-sleep mode, and sprinted. Glass doors whooshed open. The supermarket was nearly empty, just a bored cashier, a janitor with earbuds in, and an old woman comparing soup labels. Evelyn ducked behind an aisle, breathing hard. Seconds later, the doors opened again. Footsteps. Heavy, steady, professional. She didn't look back. Instead, she slid the hard drive from its casing and reached the end of the aisle security office. The door was locked. She pulled a universal fob from her lanyard, a black cube with no brand. It blinked green. The door clicked. Inside, monitors an idle desktop system, 3 feeds still recording from roof cams. She plugged in the hard drive. Typed. Quick commands. Custom protocol. The interface blinked, hesitated. Access denied. She entered a secondary override. Harper EX3 Level X Code Phantom. A flash of blue. Then National Secure Relay established. She uploaded the file. Dean's video, the time-stamped vehicle logs, the shadowed cruiser, Rick's plate, her annotated screenshots, and a brief text alert. Agent Evelyn Harper. Active. Code 0407G. Internal leak. Command level. Suspect Captain R. Harper, Local PD. Urgent review plus shadow protocol initiate. Progress bar 27%. 54%. 91%. Upload complete. She encrypted the drive remotely auto-corrupt on tamper and yanked it free. Outside a crash. A shelf overturned. She slammed the office lights off. Through the vents she could hear the footsteps again. Closer. She moved. Slipped out through the emergency back exit which fed into a loading dock. Rain had started. Light but sharp. The asphalt gleamed. She ran. Something whizzed past her ear. She dropped behind a dumpster. Reached for her sidearm. Nothing. She'd left it in the glove box. Idiot. She crawled, low heartbeat sinking with the pulse in her neck. The footsteps came closer. Then they stopped. Her breath hitched. A flashlight beam swept the alley. Then, a phone rang. Whoever it was, they answered. She couldn't hear what they said, but the tone had changed. Urgent. Panicked. Then retreating footsteps. She waited. 30 seconds. 60. Then she moved. Half limping, half crouched. Evelyn reached the next block and hailed a passing van. Her jeans were torn at the knee. Blood was running from a cut on her arm. The driver rolled down the window, shocked. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She nodded once. "I've had worse." He let her in. She didn't look back. But she knew the mask had been torn off. They weren't just watching her anymore. They were hunting her. And now they knew she was hunting back. The chapel was quiet, too quiet for a police memorial. Rows of navy blue uniforms sat in symmetrical silence buttons glinting under the vaulted lights. Medals, badges, guns polished to reflection, an ocean of authority mourning one of its own. At the front, a black and white portrait of Dean Harper rested on a steel easel flanked by 2 honor guards. The folded flag was placed beneath. Outside, storm clouds brooded. Inside, Evelyn stood still. She wasn't in the family pew, wasn't near the front. She stood along the far wall, half-shadowed by a marble column. Her black coat was still damp from the night before. One sleeve stained dark, not from the rain. The cut on her arm burned under the fabric. She hadn't bandaged it properly. No time. The blood had dried hours ago, caking into the seams, evidence of something that would never make the official report. She didn't blink, didn't breathe too loud. Her eyes locked on one thing: her father. Ray Harper stood behind the podium in full dress uniform, shoulders square, medals pinned. His voice reverberated against the stone walls as he spoke about honor, about sacrifice, about brotherhood. Dean was the kind of man every father dreams of raising. Brave, loyal, unshakable. Evelyn's fingers curled against her coat. He didn't mention her. Of course he didn't. Even now, as the surviving daughter. Even now, still standing with dried blood on her sleeve and her jaw clenched hard enough to ache, she was invisible. She could almost hear his thoughts. At least Rick showed up clean. Then something shifted. Evelyn's eyes flicked across the room as she caught the movement. A senior officer seated 3 rows behind the podium felt his phone buzz. He glanced down under the pew subtly. Then again, longer this time. He froze. Evelyn saw it, the stiffened spine, the flicker of tension in his jaw. She watched as his gaze slowly rose from the phone to Ray Harper. Ray noticed. Their eyes met. It was only a second, but it was enough. The color drained from Ray's face. Not panic, recognition. He looked to Evelyn instinctively. She held his stare. The room kept breathing, unaware. Then the chapel doors opened. Not loud, not dramatic. But the shift in air was instant. 2 men in dark suits stepped in first, straight-backed, clipped walk. Federal. No local cop moved like that. Behind them, a woman with a badge on her hip and a file in her hand. They walked down the central aisle like a blade being drawn across a throat. The priest faltered mid-prayer. Ray turned fully, palms braced against the podium now. The officer who'd received the message whispered something to the man beside him. And Evelyn still hadn't moved. One of the agents stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, but it pierced through the organ music like gunfire. "Agent Evelyn Harper," murmurs rippled across the rows. "We need you to come with us." All heads turned. Ray's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Evelyn stepped forward slowly. The sea of uniforms parted as she walked down the aisle. She didn't stop to explain, didn't look back. She walked like someone who'd been waiting her whole life to be seen. Someone behind whispered, Wait, she's a Fed. Someone else. I thought she was just tech. She reached the front and stood near the altar. The agents didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Ray finally spoke, strained, brittle. What is this? Evelyn turned to him. Her voice was cold. Even. Deeper than it had ever sounded in that house. You knew, Dad. The SUV, the signature on the internal mission file, the deleted logs. You authorized the surveillance on Dean. The room went still. Ray's lips trembled, but he forced composure. That was classified. Evelyn's voice cracked just once. So was I. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the ID badge she hadn't worn in a decade, and dropped it on the podium with a click that echoed in the silence. Her credentials gleamed under the lights. U.S. Federal Cybercrime Task Force. Active Agent, Evelyn L. Harper. Clearance level Omega 5. Gasps. Ray staggered back a step. His whole body looked like it might shatter. Evelyn didn't wait. She turned to the agents. Let's go. They walked her out. The silence behind her wasn't just shock. It was a mask breaking, and it made a sound louder than any funeral bell ever could. The chapel had never been so quiet. Not when criminals confessed. Not even during the badge-pinning ceremonies where officers took their vows under the flag. But now you could hear the second hand on the memorial clock tick against the marble. Evelyn didn't wait for permission. She stepped back up to the front just as the agents turned to escort her away. Her voice didn't tremble. It sliced. You knew, didn't you? She turned her eyes not to the agents, not to the crowd, but straight to her father standing just behind the podium, where only moments ago he had praised Dean like a hero sculpted from stone. You knew Rick was there when Dean died. You knew Rick was the one who forced him off that road. The weight of her words struck the air like a gavel. Ray Harper didn't move. The murmurs began again. Soft, uneasy cops exchanging glances, shifting in their seats. Every instinct in their trained bodies warned them this was no longer ceremonial. Ray opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers gripped the podium, knuckles pale. Evelyn took another step forward. You signed the mission file. You signed the clearance for a pursuit operation that never made it to the logs. You knew about the ghost car. You knew about the silent 2-minute gap in the camera feeds. Then it happened. Rick stepped out from the pew, eyes bloodshot, mouth twitching. His uniform was still crisp, but something in his gait was broken, like the truth had warped his bones. He walked toward the front aisle slowly, like something wound tight was unraveling. Eve, he said, stop it, now. She didn't flinch. Why? Because someone might finally see what's behind your badge. Rick's hand twitched toward his waist. For a fraction of a second, just a breath, no one moved. Then his hand went for the gun, but he never drew. 2 federal agents closed the space in less than a second. One disarmed him with a brutal twist. The other slammed him chest first into the marble floor with a force that echoed through the chapel. Rick groaned, loud, humiliated, restrained. Cameras from the press in the back clicked to life. Flash, flash. The golden son of the Harper family on his knees, cuffed eyes wide and unblinking. Ray Harper didn't stop it. He just stood there, frozen, a father, a leader, a man whose world had been built on silence and order, now watching his legacy crumble in full view. His lips parted. The microphone caught the smallest sound, a sob. Ray sank back slightly, just one step, then another. He covered his face with both hands. I thought, he whispered, voice cracking. I thought if I kept it quiet, if I just waited, maybe it would pass. Maybe I could shield Rick, let it fade. He turned to Evelyn, eyes red broken. I didn't know Dean had found out. I didn't know he'd left a message for you. Evelyn stared, the rage caught behind her chest like a wildfire pacing behind steel bars. You didn't know, she repeated, bitter. She stepped forward slowly, knelt beside the fallen flag on the podium, lifted it. Underneath it, a plaque bore Dean's name. Her fingertips brushed the engraved lettering. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but the whole chapel heard it. And the price for that silence was Dean. Ray shook his head, but there was no strength behind it. Only an old man. A tired man. A man who had gambled his family against a system and lost. He was your son too, she said, standing now. and you chose to bury him under someone else's sin." The agent stood ready. Rick was hauled upright, bleeding from the lips, silent now. The press cameras clicked again. Flash, flash, and Ray Harper, Ohio's most decorated lieutenant, collapsed into the front pew, no longer a father, no longer a leader, just a man behind a mask that had finally cracked. There was something eerily calm about the interrogation room. The lights buzzed faintly above, casting sterile shadows across Rick Harper's face. His wrists were cuffed to the table, blood crusted near the corner of his mouth, but he didn't ask for a tissue. His eyes were red, not from pain, but from something Evelyn had never seen in her brother before surrender. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for water, just spoke. "It started 3 years ago." Rick began, his voice hoarse but steady. "After the Ramirez case, they dumped 20 kilos into evidence and half of it vanished a week later. I saw the logs get altered, and I said nothing." Across the table, Agent Bowen took notes. Evelyn stood behind the one-way glass, arms crossed, staring at the man she had once trusted to walk her down the aisle if she ever got married. "At first it was just a swap," Rick continued. "They replaced the seized bricks with baking soda. No one double-checks. The street still thinks it's off the market. But then," he exhaled, leaned back, eyes glassing. "Then it became routine. Cars would pull up to the back of precinct storage. IDs would get wiped. Chain of custody logs forged. And Dean, he figured it out. I begged him to let it go. I begged him." 51:30. Agent Bowen slid a photo forward, an image still from the USB Evelyn had found. Dean and Rick, standing by Rick's cruiser, caught mid-argument. "He recorded everything," Bowen said coldly. "Even the names." Rick nodded slow. "There were more." He listed them. Three names Evelyn recognized immediately. 3 senior officers, all of them embedded across separate departments. Narcotics, Internal Affairs, and Evidence Control. One of them had even handed Evelyn a coffee at Dean's funeral. "They called it clean recycling," Rick whispered. "Can you believe that, moving drugs back onto the street but through our own channels?" "Controlled chaos," they said. The arrests happened before sunset. SWAT didn't knock. Federal agents moved simultaneously, coordinated, precise. No headlines yet, no sirens. Just silence and zip ties. The head of Evidence Control was pulled from his golf course. The Internal Affairs commander was cuffed outside his daughter's ballet recital. And the captain who led Dean's final investigation, the one who declared it a tragic solo crash, was dragged out of his office mid-meeting, still holding a pen. Ray Harper wasn't among them. He had already handed in his badge and locked his bedroom door. The next morning, the press gathered in front of the Department of Justice. Microphones, pointed cameras humming. They expected a name, a face. They got both, but not the one they wanted. Director Morgan took the podium. Behind him, a screen flickered with one line: "Operation Third Mask. Infiltration complete. An embedded operative," Morgan said, "who uncovered a systemic breach in law enforcement ethics. Evidence tampering, drug trafficking, abuse of public trust." Pause. "The agent's identity will remain protected for operational integrity." But in the crowd, someone whispered. It was Evelyn Harper. She was offered a medal, a commendation, a public recognition. She declined them all. No press, no lights, no applause. Just one line spoken only to Director Morgan behind closed doors. "The badge should mean something again. I don't need to wear it to prove that." And then she walked out alone, but not invisible anymore. The office was silent, the kind of silence that didn't invite peace, but punishment. Dust clung to the window blinds. Papers sat untouched on a desk that once barked orders, closed cases, demanded loyalty. The nameplate on the door still read, Lieutenant Raymond Harper, but the man no longer felt worthy of the title. Ray stood still for a long moment before reaching for the old leather box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, photos of his children when they were young. Dean in a blue uniform too big for his teen shoulders. Rick grinning on a bike Evelyn had helped him fix. And Evelyn, always in the background, always behind a book or a screen. Hidden. Misread. He picked up his badge, held it in his palm like it still held power, then laid it down, gently, like a man burying a weapon he should never have picked up. He opened the bottom drawer and took out the resignation letter, signed it, folded it. 34 years on the force. He walked out with a single cardboard box. No send-off, no claps. Just a hallway of officers looking down at their shoes, pretending not to know what shame smelled like. Ray's truck waited in the back parking lot. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he sat in the driver's seat staring at the envelope in his hand. He pulled out one more sheet of paper, this one blank except for his handwriting. Evelyn, you were right. I wore the wrong mask for 34 years. I convinced myself it was a shield, but I see now it was a mirror, one that only reflected what I feared most, being a coward. Your brother deserved better. You deserved better. I see you now. I see all of you, and I'm sorry it took me this long. Dad. He didn't sign it, Ray. He signed it Dad. The letter arrived the next morning, folded carefully. No stamp, just dropped through the slot at Evelyn's apartment. She read it while standing in the kitchen, still in her hoodie from the night before. The steam from her tea rose and twisted in the light. The paper trembled in her hands. She didn't cry, but her throat locked. She tucked the letter inside the back of her journal, the one she used to map out Dean's death. A fitting end to the last page. Later that day, Evelyn drove alone. No mission, no handler, just her and the road. The cemetery sat quiet, tucked behind a line of frost-covered birch trees. A gentle wind rolled across the marble rows like a whisper too soft to follow. Jetton sunburn. She parked and walked toward the far edge of the plot. The grave wasn't fresh anymore, but it hadn't aged. Dean's name was carved clean into the headstone. Dean Harper, 1984, 2024. Truth was never a quiet thing. She knelt, resting one palm on the cold stone. I did it, Dean, she whispered. You were right. About everything. A pause. A swallow. I was so scared I wouldn't be enough. That I was just the girl with the computer. The one they forgot at the table. But I saw it through. I didn't run. The wind pressed through the trees, tugging at her coat, and Dad knows now. I don't know if that matters to you, but it matters to me. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a coin. One Dean had given her the night before he shipped out for his first academy tour. A pressed penny with the word honor etched into it. I kept it. She smiled faintly. Always kept it. Even when I hated you. She placed it gently at the base of the grave. Thank you, Dean, for trusting me. A moment passed, and Evelyn sat down beside the grave, not as an agent, not as a daughter, not as a witness to corruption, just as a sister, a woman with a scar that finally had a name. The sun broke through the clouds just enough to warm the back of her neck. She closed her eyes and leaned into it. Not healing. Not yet, but no longer hiding. The rain had long stopped, but the scent of it still lingered in the gravel outside Quantico. The corridors were quieter than she remembered them, less about boots hitting the floor, more about breath held between decisions. Evelyn's steps echoed as she walked through the training wing, a canvas folder tucked under one arm. She passed rows of young cadets seated in front of terminals. Eyes fixed on algorithm strings, some sweating over anomaly recognition tests. One girl in the back, dark curls, clenched jaw, the same type of silence Evelyn used to wear, like a uniform, looked up as she walked by. Evelyn stopped, nodded once, and kept going. She now wore the badge of Instructor Harper, a quiet nameplate pinned beneath her FBI clearance. Her field days were over. But in every digital crime pattern, in every young mind, learning to track a ghost through code, Evelyn Harper still fought. Just from behind the veil now. No more front lines. No more blood. But the war always found a way to whisper back. She stepped into a small cafe not far from the center. Lena was already waiting boots on the table, laptop open, sipping some kind of thick coffee sludge only hackers could tolerate. "You're late," Lena smirked. Evelyn slid into the seat. "I've been decoding 3 terabytes of agent arrogance all morning." "That's the FBI I know and loathe," Lena replied. "So, this place?" Evelyn dropped a worn envelope onto the table. Inside were photos, reports, letters, obituaries, mostly men, a few women, all officers, all dead, all buried without honor. "Some of them were like Dean," she said, voice low. "Killed because they knew something. Others just stood in the wrong hallway when the story got rewritten." Lena's grin vanished. "I want to start a center," Evelyn continued. "Not just a memorial, a truth bank. Every buried report, every suppressed audio, a place where survivors or families can come and know. We owe them that." "And you want me to run point?" Evelyn nodded. "You got yourself a problem, Harper. I'm allergic to bureaucracy." "That's why I picked you." Lena looked away, then back. "We'll need funding. Clearance. Protection. I've already got 2 senators who owe me favors. We'll start small. Quiet." Lena reached for the envelope again, this time gently. "I'll need full back-end access. No firewalls." I figured. They didn't shake hands, didn't smile. Some wars didn't end. They simply grew more dignified in how they were fought. That night, Evelyn sat alone on her balcony, watching lights from other windows blink to life like distant signals in an ocean of silence. In her hands, a leather-bound wallet. Inside, a photo tucked behind her ID. It wasn't just Dean anymore. There were 3 faces now. Dean young and stubborn, forever noble even in his recklessness. Rick, his eyes like the night before a storm, equal parts love and damage. And Ray, their father. The man who learned too late. But still learned. 3 faces, 3 masks, 3 truths. She ran her finger slowly across the photo, tracing the outline of each man, like she was trying to remember what grief felt like when it stopped burning. They weren't saints. They weren't villains. They were a family. And she was the last one standing. Not because she was stronger, but because she had finally decided to stop being invisible. The moonlight caught the edge of the photo as she slipped it back into her wallet. Somewhere in the distance, the faint buzz of a new message lit up her encrypted laptop. Another case, another thread. But for tonight, Evelyn Harper allowed herself to sit still, alive, scarred, and finally seen. The wind that evening had the hush of unfinished prayers. Autumn had finally begun painting its colors across Ohio, dusting the trees in a gold that made everything look briefly holy, like the land itself wanted a second chance. The gates to the center Evelyn built were quiet. No press, no visitors, just a brass plaque by the entrance for those who were silenced. Ray Harper stood alone in front of it. His suit was pressed, but the collar slightly off. His posture had once commanded a unit of 60 men, but now it bore the weight of one secret that had cracked him in half. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't step inside. Instead, he pulled a folded check from his coat and slid it into the donation box. The amount wasn't extravagant, but it was enough to keep the lights on for a month. He didn't sign his name, but he didn't need to. Inside, Evelyn watched from the security feed. Her hand hovered over the intercom, then fell. Some reunions needed silence first. He turned to leave, but stopped, and walked through the door. It was the first time they had stood face to face in over 6 months. The air between them was charged, not with anger anymore, but with something quieter, something heavier. Like standing in the ruins of a house you both once called home. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't offer a seat. Ray didn't ask for one. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was fraying at the edges. He held it out without words. She took it, unwrapping it slowly, her fingers stiff with the caution of someone afraid of what memory might do to them. Dean's badge, scuffed, bent slightly at the edge, but still shining. Her breath caught in her throat. Ray's voice finally broke the stillness. He dropped it the day before he died. Told me he'd be back for it. Evelyn looked up. "I kept it," he said. "For the longest time I thought I'd give it to Rick. Keep it in the family." He swallowed. The words came out like rust, but I was wrong about a lot of things. She didn't speak. Her fingers clenched tighter around the badge. Ray took a deep breath. "You earned it. Hell, you earned it a long time ago. I just couldn't see past my own damn image of what a Harper should look like." Silence, thicker than grief, sharper than guilt. He stepped closer, voice softer now. "And maybe I thought giving it to you meant admitting I never really knew who my daughter was." Evelyn blinked back something hot, something sharp. "It wasn't about the badge, Dad." "I know, but it was never about Dean or Rick being better either. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to be part of the family without needing to scream for space." Ray nodded slowly. "I built a house on titles, ranks, loyalty, and forgot the faces under those uniforms." Her hands were trembling now. She stared down at the badge in her palm like it was a relic from a life she both missed and mourned. Dean's initials were still etched on the back, small, faint, barely visible unless you looked hard enough. She closed her fist around it. Tears didn't fall, but her eyes glistened. I think she whispered he always knew I'd end up holding it. Ray stepped back, gave a small nod, then without another word turned toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "The center. It's good work, Evie." Her throat tightened at the sound of her childhood nickname. "You make sure people remember him, right?" he added. She did, and she would. The door closed behind him, and Evelyn Harper stood alone. Dean's badge in one hand, 1,000 memories in the other, finally stitched together, not by justice, but by recognition. Rick Harper stood in the courtroom. Hands cuffed his orange jumpsuit, strangely too large for the man who used to fill out his uniform like armor. The buzz of reporters, the quiet stir of the public benches, the occasional rustle of paper from attorneys all fell to silence when the judge nodded at him. I'd like to read something." "Your Honor," Rick said. Voice rasped with hesitation. Permission granted. He unfolded a letter. His hands trembled. To Evelyn, to Dad. He paused, eyes flickering toward the front row where Ray Harper sat like a statue, stoic hollow, and where Evelyn sat, chin lifted but fingers clenched so hard her knuckles were white. "I've done things I can't undo. I betrayed the badge, betrayed Dean, and I betrayed you, Evelyn. I thought I could protect what I had by hiding the rot. But I became the rot." He swallowed, eyes watering. Dean knew. He confronted me weeks before the accident, and I was so scared. Not scared of prison, scared of being nothing. So I lied. I let it happen. I watched him drive away that night, and I knew. The courtroom was breathless. "And Dad," Rick turned slightly, voice shaking harder, "you wanted to believe in us. You wore your pride like armor. But the truth is your pride blinded you." He looked back to Evelyn. "You were always the strongest one. You didn't wear the uniform, but you carried the weight. And I'm sorry. For burying Dean. For burying the truth. I hope, one day, you'll remember me as your brother." He folded the paper slowly, not wiping his tears. The judge sentenced him 18 years without parole. Ray didn't move. Evelyn nodded once acknowledgement, not absolution. The sentence was only the beginning. That week, 4 other officers were arrested. The same names Dean had whispered in his final recordings. Their faces, once shielded by medals and polished boots, now filled headlines beside the word corruption. An entire narcotics evidence ring was dismantled, decades of quiet smuggling of confiscated drugs, cover-ups of shootings, laundering favors through thin blue silence, and in the center of it all a name. Evelyn Harper, not anonymous anymore. One headline read, "She dismantled her own house, the woman who unmasked 3 generations of Ohio police." They printed her picture taken outside the courthouse, dressed in plain black eyes, shadowed jaw set. She hated the cameras. She hated that Dean wasn't standing beside her, but she walked forward anyway. News anchors debated her bravery. Talk shows speculated about Ray Harper's legacy. Commentators praised her, feared her, dismissed her, elevated her. But Evelyn kept to herself. She declined every interview, every invitation, every award. When the department offered a public medal of distinction, she simply replied, "You don't pin medals on truth, you carry it." In a small room back at the training academy, Evelyn stood in front of a new class of recruits. "You're here because you believe in justice," she began. "But remember, justice isn't a uniform. It's not a badge. It's not a brotherhood. It's a choice. Every day." Silence. Then someone raised a hand. "Is it true you were undercover even when your brother died?" She nodded. "Yes." "Did it change how you see the job?" Evelyn held their gaze. "It changed how I see family." The bell rang. Recruits filed out. One lingered. A young woman no older than 22. "My dad's a cop. He says you're the bravest woman he's never met." Evelyn smiled softly. "Tell him thanks. And tell him not to wait too long to meet his daughter again." Later that day, Evelyn walked past a hallway wall portraits of fallen officers lined the wood. She paused at Dean's. Someone had placed a single white lily beneath the frame. She touched the photo. Not a salute, not a tear, just a whisper, "I kept my promise." And she walked on. The lecture hall wasn't grand. The chairs squeaked. The screen buzzed faintly behind her, and someone had left a half-drunk coffee on the desk in the front row. But Evelyn stood tall at the podium, her frame anchored by something invisible, unshakable. The late morning light poured through the tall windows behind her, striking her from the side. It painted a hard gleam on the faint scar that sloped down the side of her cheek, the scar she no longer tried to hide. She adjusted her mic, cleared her throat. In the silence, 50 cadets stared up at her. Some were only 22. A few had uniforms too stiff, as if afraid to wrinkle them. She scanned the room, her eyes quiet but assertive, until she landed on a girl in the back ponytail, narrow shoulders, trembling fingers over a tablet. Evelyn began. "When people say integrity is the foundation of law enforcement, what they really mean is this. One day, someone close to you will cross a line, and you'll have to decide if your silence is loyalty or betrayal." A pause. The air tensed. "They won't teach you that in the academy," she added. "But I just did." There was no applause, just stillness, thought. Someone shifted in their seat. At the back of the room, Lena leaned against the doorframe, watching her old friend. Not the analyst, not the secret agent, not even the daughter of a legacy cop, but the woman who had walked through blood silence and betrayal and still found something worth teaching. The bell rang. Students shuffled out. Some nodded, some averted their eyes. But the girl with the ponytail stayed behind, clutching her tablet. Evelyn stepped down from the podium. "You okay? I just wanted to say, I lost my uncle in a case. They called it an overdose, but it never made sense. No one investigated." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a thin card, and handed it to her. "Come to this center. We archive every overlooked case in the state. We don't promise miracles, but we don't bury the truth." The girl's eyes watered. "Thank you, Agent Hari." "Evelyn," she interrupted, smiling. Outside, the wind was soft, carrying the scent of wet leaves and sun-warmed stone. Lena waited by a bench, kicking at a crack in the concrete. "You still carry the photo?" Lena asked, nodding to Evelyn's wallet. Evelyn sat down beside her and pulled it out. 3 faces. Dean in uniform, Rick in cuffs, Ray in silence. The photo wasn't meant for forgiveness. It was a map, a warning, a reminder. "I used to think I wanted justice," Evelyn said, "but I didn't. I wanted truth. And the cost of truth is that it changes everything." Lena tilted her head, and now Evelyn looked up at the sun. "Now I teach others how to survive the truth without letting it turn them into someone they hate." They sat in silence for a while. No ticking clocks, no radio static, just the sound of leaves scraping pavement and a distant lawnmower humming like an old memory. Later that evening, Evelyn returned to the center. A new shipment of case files had arrived, anonymous, fragile, yellow with age. She placed them carefully on the counter, then turned to the memorial wall. There a plaque under Dean's badge read, "To those who told the truth too soon." She reached out, touched the corner of the metal, and closed her eyes. "I kept my promise," she whispered. Fade into darkness. A soft voice over Evelyn's filled the screen. "There are scars we hide because they hurt, and there are scars we keep visible because they remind us of the truth we chose to stand for." The screen faded to black. Only her voice remained echoing, even when that truth cost us everything.